Joining us now on the Picks for Pulse podcast, he's coming to us from Texas by way of Tampa Bay, Florida, and Chicago, Illinois. We've got Eric Henry in the house. He covers the Longhorns for 247 Sports. You can follow him on Twitter at EricCHenry_. We were just talking because he lived in Chicago for a few years right before we hit the record button. And so we were discussing how, 1 minute can be 70 degrees like it was on Tuesday here of this week. And then the next minute it can be, 30 degrees, rain, wind, and snow all at once. But how's it going? Thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, man, not a problem. My pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. Listen, I know any time it says, of course, the phone won't stop going off. That is, you can tell it's NFL combine season here, right? No, I appreciate you having me on. We were talking, before we started recording that. I love Chicago. I as a native Floridian who grew up and it was 90 degrees all the time. I love the seasons. I love the city. I'm probably that weirdo that, loves the CTA, loves the red line, loves the L. But the thing that kind of summed it up for me is like, all right, I eventually gotta get back home and I'd graduated, finished grad school, but there was a stretch where I want to say it was January going to February. It was something like high 30s, low 40s. So not cold enough to snow, but like rainy and overcast and something like that for 20 something straight days. And that just wears on you. So that I do not miss about the Windy City, but I miss those Chicago summers without a doubt.
Yeah. I mean, I will always say I hate driving into the city for Bears games in November and December at times, sometimes in January, but getting a chance to go there and, July, August, September, just hang out in the city is obviously a great vibe. So I have to ask you this. What's your favorite deep dish pizza place? Are you even a deep dish fan?
Oh, come on. There's one right answer to this, right, guys? It's Lou's. I mean, Lou's is the correct answer. It pains me when, I have friends of mine who go to Chicago or people who visit like, oh, I had deep dish. And I guess I shouldn't throw any particular chain under the bus, right, on this podcast, but a noted popular chain that tourists tend to try is one that I'm like, listen, if you had that, that's not it. Lou's all the way.
Absolutely. And Lou's is my favorite thing too, especially when you add giardiniera hot pepper to their deep dish.
Yes.
I was, just actually ordered it the other night, but we're going to have to get into some Longhorns football here because it is as much as we want to probably talk about deep dish, we can save that for an off-season casual convo. Or if I ever end up in Austin or you end up here, we can go to Lou's and, have pizza and chop it up about stuff that's not football, I guess. But let's just get right into this thing. I mean, it was a big year for the Longhorns. They end up beating Alabama. They go on to win the Big 12. And then in the midst of all that, you have a lot of guys, right, that ended up taking a significant step forward, which I think anytime you beat Alabama and you get to go ahead and win your basically conference, I mean, you have to have a lot of experience, right? Where you had Xavier Worthy, Tavian Sanders, Adonai Mitchell, Quinn Ewers even coming back, from the injury that he suffered in 2022. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you had Tavondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, Jalen Ford, and a handful of other guys to cap off what was basically a phenomenal season.
Oh, listen, I mean, in terms of Texas's 2024 campaign, it was a magical run. It's the season that folks in these parts here in Austin, Texas, and really throughout the Lone Star State. I mean, I think this will be my first year on the beat, truly learning. Well, yes, you have Texas Tech fans, you have Aggie fans, you have Baylor fans, you have TCU fans, and obviously TCU coming off a national title run from the year prior, or I guess national championship appearance. There is nothing like when the Longhorns reign supreme here in the Lone Star State. So it certainly was a magical year. And I mean, I guess I can just kind of run down. You talk about some of the names there. Quinn Ewers, certainly a major player and someone who I think the biggest question with Quinn coming into the year was really two. One, could he take the next step and progress as a quarterback under a noted quarterback developer, a noted offensive guru in Steve Sarkisian? Very much did that, was able to repeat his success from the year prior in terms of protecting the football while also increasing his completion percentage. Quinn is a guy who was deadly accurate, when you talk about those intermediate short game passes, those mesh routes, things that kind of get the ball in your hands of receivers immediately. Quinn's excellent at that. The other question was the deep ball, right? And that's still a part of Quinn's game that is left, still leaves a little bit to be desired, especially when you have deep threats like Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell. even a JT Sanders, who can go over the middle as a tight end and really stretch the defense. But Quinn it's just now that Texas hasn't back for 2024. That's never expected to develop. But I think the two biggest pieces, if we had to kind of break it down, one on offense, one on defense, offensively, Jonathan Brooks, someone who didn't even start the year as a starting running back. It was the 5-star 247 Sports 5-star number 1 rated running back in the class of 2023. CJ Baxter earned the starting job out of camp. And if you take a look at CJ, 6'1", 218, there's a reason why his teammates were likening him to Bijan Robinson coming out of fall camp. Someone who's got the size and athleticism, speed to make all the big plays, but there's an adjustment to the college game that has to take place. And with CJ, I think a combination of him learning kind of just, not being the big back that can just run past everybody or just run through everybody like he did down at Edgewater High School in Florida. Had to learn the position a little bit more. That definitely took some time. And also he got banged up a little bit, which paved the way for Jonathan Brooks, someone who, quite frankly, before he tore his ACL at TCU, you could have made a case he was a top running back in college football. So that's offensively was kind of the big thing. Defensively, T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy. It starts with those guys, and the entire defense takes their attitude from those guys. The entire front seven really played well off of just there's 2 stout defensive tackles. Pro Football Focus rated Sweat and Murphy as the top 2 rated defensive tackles in the nation, really from week 3 through the duration of the year. So having those 2 guys up front, T'Vondre, the Defensive Player of the Year in the Big 12, Outland Award winner, and Byron Murphy, someone who's looking at is probably a first-round pick because of his sheer athleticism, size, 6'1", 303 pounds. I mean, the measurables of things he'll do in the combine in Indianapolis going on this week. Everything really started as far as the Texas defense with those 2 guys, and that paved the way for a 12-win year and nearly came down to the final play of the game, making it to a national title game here in Texas.
Yeah, that was awesome, by the way, because you kind of hit on a lot of, some of the other points, but you just kind of look at, Texas in general. I think everyone at some point in their life has heard that, and again, for whatever reason, there's a large faction of Bears fans in places like California and Texas, and I'm probably going to throw Florida into the mix too, but, it's interesting because you have like 6 or 7 big schools down there. So football certainly reigns supreme in Texas at the college level and at the high school level. You kind of look at a lot of the guys that have declared coming from the Longhorns program. And it's interesting because if you were to sit here in August and we're going to have this conversation, right, in terms of, hey, who are some guys that you're watching that could potentially take a step forward and declare for the draft? The diehard fans would tell you, and the plugged-in beat writers would say, oh, well, Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell, couple wide receivers, T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy. But the reality is that all 4 of them, in a sense, you could argue, weren't necessarily kind of the hottest names to know. And then as the season progressed, everybody seemed to fall in love with the 2 interior linemen. Everybody suddenly fell in love with the 2 wide receivers as well. But focusing on those pass catchers, I mean, you have 3 really good ones down there, and you've got Worthy and Mitchell along with Jatavian Sanders. I mean, what makes each of those 3 guys so unique?
Xavier Worthy's game begins and ends with speed because it is elite speed. I mean, if you talk with people who've been around the program, from the time he arrived in 2022, they just talk about the fact that this is a guy who defenses have to respect. And that's the type of thing at the NFL. I mean, you take a look at guys like Tyreek Hill, and you can go down the list. Those speed guys who instantaneously, when they step on the field, defensive coordinators have to account for their ability to take the top off the defense and the type of pressure that puts on a secondary. And I'd say X, even from a route running perspective, really improved this year. The biggest thing in terms of, probably pro potential, I take a look what Worthy is. Last year in 2022, we're 2024, so I'm getting my years mixed up, but his sophomore year, 2022, you take a look, he played through a broken hand, and if you take a look at the amount of targets, Steve Sarkisian was open about this. In order to get him 5 or 6 receptions, we had to force him 14 or 15 passes, just kind of get the ball in his hands. This year, he would have, had a multitude of games. I had multiple games this year where you throw him 10 passes, he catches 7, he catches 8. It's that type of reception rate that I think at the next level you have to be encouraged by. Now, Adonai Mitchell, it goes by Adonai or AD, depending on what you may have heard him called, but the thing about him is just, you even go back to his time at Georgia. For viewers who may not know, a kid who began his career at Georgia, won a pair of national titles there, was a starter there. Kind of dealt with some injuries and also came back home as a young daughter. He's from Texas, so wanted to get back closer to home to be a family man. And he steps right into the Longhorns lineup. And what really impressed me most about him was when Quinn Ewers got banged up this year, had a sprained AC joint and missed a couple of games. You go to a backup quarterback and Malik Murphy, someone who was having his first career starts, and AD ends up being the safety blanket, ends up being that guy that, hey, down the red zone, I'm just going to look his way, and third and whatever, we're going to go AD's way. Just that type of camaraderie that he had, even some of the younger quarterbacks, I think kind of showed off just kind of his ability. And I think in terms of the pro potential, again, athleticism, maybe not quite Xavier Worthy's speed, but it's a very smooth receiver, someone you can tell his best football is yet to be played. And really quick on JT Sanders, that's a matchup nightmare. I'm really intrigued to see what JT runs in the 40, because he's a guy who the big emphasis for Steve Sarkisian and tight ends coach Jeff Banks, offensive coordinator Kyle Flood coming into the year was he's a guy who set the Texas tight end position record, a single season record for receptions by a tight end as a sophomore. As a sophomore. And the thing that they wanted to do with him was they wanted to get him downfield vertically more. They felt that, yes, while JT, if you get the ball in his hands on some of those tight end screens and some of those things at the line of scrimmage, or some of those underneath things kind of crossing the face of the first level of defense, those linebackers, things of that nature, yes, they help. But we got to find a way to get this guy the ball downfield. He's too big at 6'4", 245 pounds, too athletic. And even if you go back last year, or 2022, he was the most efficient deep threat in comparison to guys like Xavier Worthy and Casey Cain's been other receivers on that team. So if you take a look at JT this year, he got banged up, had an ankle injury that really kind of, I'd say, hampered him from really, maybe hitting that Brock Bowers like of numbers and maybe recognition. But JT is still a guy in my mind. If he tests well in Indy and tests well his pro day, yes, the blocking is something you're going to be concerned about, but there's no reason in my mind he can't be a Kyle Pitts like tight end at the next level, or is what you expected Kyle Pitts to be like.
Yeah, see, that is such an intriguing comparison right there, because when you look at a lot of these tight ends that have come out over the last couple of years, it's crazy in a sense, because like you mentioned Kyle Pitts, and just because you're drafted in round 1 and you were a stud in college, does not necessarily mean you are going to be, the biggest and the baddest and the cream of the crop at the next level. And Sanders to me is so interesting, because when you watch his film, he does a little bit of everything that you would like from a modern day tight end. Like, you can put him on the line of scrimmage in line and ask him to help be an extra blocker in the run game. And then all of a sudden you look 3 to 5 plays later, and now he's flexed out into the slot, and he's got Mitchell or Worthy on either side of him, to his left or to his right. And all of a sudden that's causing all sorts of craziness for the defense. And then you look at a guy who, just in terms of his production, had 99 receptions over the last 2 years. And it's very clear that, that first year that he was down there in Austin, had he really gotten some playing time in 2021, it's possible he's finishing his career there in Austin with like 150 something receptions probably.
Oh yeah. Listen, Steve Sarkisian he's talked about it with JT, that he felt he really needed a year to learn and develop. He talked about a kid who played at Denton Ryan, a really well-known high school down. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say down here, because it's up in North Texas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but nevertheless played both sides of the ball, defensive end and tight end. They felt they just needed a year to get him right at tight end, but he stepped in as a redshirt freshman, sophomore. He didn't redshirt, but it just didn't, appear much on offense, and was ready to go. And the thing with JT, when you talk about his blocking, people tend to fall on different sides of the coin. I'll say this. I think it needs to be more consistent. People like to cherry pick, and this is kind of, it's the social media environment we live in nowadays, on X, I guess formerly known as Twitter, right? And wherever you want to look, people cherry pick a kid, a player or two from a kid and say, oh, he can't do this or can't do that, right? But then you have someone like me who's been around this player, if not their entirety of their career, at least an entirety of a season. JT Sanders, when he wants to block, he can block. And you get JT fired up and he wants to be a nasty guy who just, gets out there, and like you said, in line, JT can block. I think the big thing is consistently, JT needs to probably improve that more in terms of the next level, but certainly someone I think you got to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that blocking, I feel like for him, wherever he ends up, is just going to be something that does come naturally to him, especially as he adds more strength to his frame. But they played a 4-2-5 down there last year, and again, they've kind of done that throughout the Steve Sarkisian era. There's some pretty decent linebackers in the system there, but again, as we mentioned, the real focus is Byron Murphy and T'Vondre Sweat. I mean, those two guys, they only combined for 7 sacks last season, but every time the Longhorns defense was on the field, those guys were around the ball on every single down, it seemed like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, don't let the sack numbers fool you in terms of, first off, T'Vondre Sweat is not someone who's ever going to have 10 sacks at the NFL level. I mean, God bless him. T-Sweat is a lot of things, but he's also 6'3" ish, 6'4" ish. The weight, I guess we'll find out this week, right? T-Sweat didn't weigh in down in Mobile, probably for a reason. He is listed at 362, I believe. I mean, at times, standing next to the man, I am not, a doctor, but I would guess to say he might have been a little bit bigger than 362 at times. So he's not someone who's going to, be some standout pass rusher. What he is a game-wrecking presence on the inside who, quite frankly, teams couldn't block. Their teams want to run the football, but how do you do it when you have T'Vondre Sweat there who's going to eat up? And listen, he is not just a big, I don't want to disparage, insert defensive tackle, right? But he's not just a space eater. He's someone who, with his athleticism and strength, is making plays into the backfield and disrupting running plays and things of that nature. And it was just a perfect compliment with him paired next to Byron Murphy, who was, as I said, 6'1", 303 pounds. I don't want to, put too much pressure on the kid, but when you talk about an NFL comp, dude's a dead ringer for Aaron Donald. I mean, you see him with, physically speaking, it just 303 pounds is not supposed to look in terms of that body fat and, ripped up the way it does with Byron Murphy. He is someone who at the next level, I could easily see being a 50 tackle, 60 tackle, guy gets north of 7, 8, 9 sacks per year. So yes, those two guys certainly, spearheaded the Texas defense, and, even some of the guys who played off them. You talk about Texas playing a 4-2-5. Primary linebackers were Jalen Ford, who is someone I think is a prospect to keep an eye on, and definitely a day 3 guy, is seen depending on how he tests. And they have a couple of rising linebackers, guys like Anthony Hill, who probably, in 2 years will come back and do this podcast, and he'll be easily a first-round talent at middle linebacker, right? So, but yes, the defense did primarily run through those two guys up the middle.
So you mentioned Jalen Ford, and so you have your obviously guys at the very top, right? Your Mitchell, your Sanders, the Murphy and Sweat, but then there's also a handful of lesser-known guys that have declared, and again, they always seem to fall through the cracks. Like living here in Chicago, last year Roschon Johnson was that guy because he was in Texas, played for the Longhorns. All the attention at the running back position obviously went to Bijan Robinson, but Roschon, when he got a chance to play, looked good. Who are some guys that declared that are not going to be there next year that people need to keep an eye on, either as UDFAs or late day 2 guys or early day 3?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll quickly touch on Jalen. I mean, what I really like about Jalen Ford, this has been his entire football story. A kid from North Texas who wanted to be a Longhorn, wasn't necessarily recruited by them immediately, almost ends up, I believe it's at Kansas, if memory serves me correct, and then ends up getting the late scholarship offer. But he's someone who's always around the football, 6'3", 242 pounds, memory serves correct, what Jalen's listed at. So he's a big, sizable guy, but plays the pass really well, super athletic. He's just a guy who I think maybe is a situational linebacker, but someone who certainly can be a special teamer and make an impact. But as far as some of those guys who maybe, as UDFAs or, late day 3 guys, first person who stands out is Jordan Whittington. Jay Witt is someone who Steve Sarkisian's been adamant that is going to play a decade in the National Football League. And you can see why. It's his, he can contribute on special teams, whether it's as a punt returner, as a gunner, as a kick returner. But he's just that guy who, in terms of being an NFL receiver, an NFL mentality, I cannot think of a more mature, and these things all sound cliche, right? When you start going mature and whatnot, it's like, oh, those are things you say about a guy who doesn't have a talent. With Jordan, it couldn't be far from the case. It just stands out so well in that if you need a pro, a veteran in the room, someone who you know is going to show up on time, do everything that's asked to make the team, that's Jordan Whittington. The thing that stands out most about him on the field, probably his ability to block from the receiver spot. You know, I don't want to, label him like Hines Ward-esque or someone, who's been like a Hall of Fame blocker at the receiver position, but definitely a guy who blocks his position really well, opens up things in the run game. If Bears fans have a chance to check out one play, you can definitely find this one on YouTube. It's the TCU game where I'm going to try to recall the play exactly, but basically Xavier Worthy catches a pass downfield, looks like he's going to break away, ends up getting stripped. So the TCU defender lays on top of Xavier Worthy. Jordan Whittington from the other side of the field, he was on the other side, running around the other side of the play, hauls butt probably 50, 60 yards downfield, ends up stripping the TCU defender. And Xavier Worthy, who was laid on top of by his own guy, raced downfield as well to recover the fumble. So if you want to see someone just in terms of sheer effort, that play sums up Jordan Whittington as a whole. Another guy I keep an eye on is Keelan Robinson, a backup running back, someone who was mainly the third down back in 2022, but Steve Sarkisian and Jeff Banks have been adamant that they felt like he's one of the top gunners in college football. And Keelan is a guy who, again, we'll see what the speed says. He's in Indianapolis now at the combine, see what the 40 time is. He thinks he's going to run sub 4.4. And if he can do that, that in my mind at least makes him a candidate as someone who can be a kick returner, punt returner, gunner. Keelan actually does well in pass pro, for a third down back, for a smaller guy who's 5'9", $185. Can catch the ball real well in the backfield. So again, someone who is never going to be a full-time running back. He was even never that in college, but someone who I think is a guy who, because of the multitude of things he can do, it would be a good addition to any NFL roster.
I mean, yeah, those, and again, I've watched some of Jordan Whittington, definitely kind of your like high motor type player, a guy who ultimately you look at and you just begin to say, okay, this is someone who has a high level of toughness, certainly has a bit of an attitude edge, a chip on his shoulder, certainly a guy that you look at and fans are going to go ahead and fall in love with. But got two more questions for you here as we kind of go ahead and start to wrap this thing up. I mean, there's all these guys that are departing. What's next for Texas in terms of having to replace 3 receivers along with 2 interior linemen and, a couple linebackers as well?
Yeah, I'll kind of quickly touch on, all 3 of those spots. Hey, Steve Sarkisian got a haul this offseason. He got Isaiah Bond, probably best known to college football fans as the player who made the game-winning reception against Auburn this year in the Iron Bowl, and that great comeback. A guy who was a game-breaking speed demon to get him to transfer over to Texas. Obviously, that came with the retirement of Nick Saban. Be able to go and get a former Houston receiver, Matthew Golden, someone who was a 4-star recruit, played behind Tank Dell his freshman year, had some injury issues last year, but still a very talented guy. Can play special teams, can return kicks, and probably his best football is ahead of him, playing with a quarterback like Quinn Ewers. And then also very quietly got Silas Bolden, Oregon State's diminutive receiver, guy's about 5'8", 5'9", $170, but someone who had over 50 grabs last year, has been a very consistent receiver for Oregon State. So they're not turning to some of their highly, touted 4-star, 5-star freshmen who they recruited at the receiver spot. Sark knows that this year is probably just as important as last year in terms of having the talent to win a national championship. Why not go get some guys who've been there and done that? They certainly have bolstered that receiver spot. I think you asked about the defensive tackles next. So here's a name to keep an eye on. Alfred Collins had a decision, could have come out this year, because in terms of just, again, sheer measurables, 6'5", 320 pounds, has the total package in terms of size, athleticism. The thing with AC for his entire career, and he'll be a fifth-year senior this year, was consistency, motor, doing it every play. Talked with his former defensive line coach, Bo Davis, now with LSU, and he said that the big thing with him is now increasing his pass rush. He was the best pass rushing defensive tackle on this team. Just now need him to, be more consistent in that regard, get to the quarterback and be consistent run stuffer. He's now going to be a full-time starter. He was a platoon guy behind Murphy and Sweat, behind Keandre Coburn and Moro Ojimo and guys like that. Right now, it's gonna be a full-time starter this year. We'll see what happens. It's gonna be he and Alfred Broughton. They also brought in a transfer from Arizona, Tia Savea. So those are a couple of guys to keep an eye on as far as the defensive tackle spot. And then at linebacker, as I mentioned, listen, if you're not familiar with the name Anthony Hill Jr. now, just do yourself a favor and get familiar, because 2 years from now, you're gonna be talking about a guy who's going to be a first-round pick, 6'3", 235. The word coming out of camp is that he's actually a guy who's transitioned from being just primarily an edge guy who Sark and the staff wanted to bring him along very slowly. They were very adamant in saying, hey, you know, we don't want to overload this kid. We know he's a 5-star talent, 5-star potential. We just want him to see ball, hit ball, go find the ball. And he did that, especially in big games. I mean, he ended up being second on this team in sacks last year and wasn't even a full-time starter. But now, as he progresses, he's a possibility. He could be the starting middle linebacker this time next year. And if you talk about a guy who has those type of instincts plus the pass rushing ability, that's going to be huge. And then as far as who might play next to him, as you said, you know, a lot of 4-2-5. You have a really great nickelback in Jahdae Barron, who's going to hold down that spot this year, the star role for Texas. So that other linebacker, there's a lot of competition. You got Kendrick Blackshire coming from Alabama. You have veteran David Benda. This guy's been here, you know, he's a fifth-year guy. I'm trying to remember if he's a fifth or sixth-year guy. He's a fifth-year guy. Can play weak side, can play, you know, in the middle as well. So should be some interesting competition at linebacker. But either way, I mean, a lot of talent here back in Austin. And there's a reason why the hopes are high that even with them heading to the SEC, they're going to be competing for not only a SEC title, but a national title in 2024.
I mean, hey, that competing for, well, moving from the Big 12 to the SEC is going to be really fun. Like, SEC and Big Ten football are already, you know, the best of the best. And now I think things are going to get even better. But before we get out of here, you know, where can people follow you on Twitter as well as, you know, keep up with your work?
No, like I said, appreciate you having me. I don't know, always fun to talk a little beers. As I said, lived in Chicago for 3 years. So that certainly was the team to follow when I was there. But you can find my work on Twitter at Eric C. Henry _ 247sports.com, CBSsports.com, whether it's, you know, Texas football. We're in March Madness. So if you're a college hoops fan, you know, I know I was in Big Ten country there. So a lot of college hoops fans check us out for coverage of March Madness there. Let's see, 247 Sports, CBSsports.com, Horns247.com as well. And if you want to check me out, the podcast, the flagship podcast, just punch it into anywhere you'd find, you know, on YouTube, Horns247 on YouTube, or find your podcast and check us out for plenty of Texas sports coverage.
Absolutely. We will have to, you know, I'll have to check a lot of that stuff out as well. But thanks so much for being on the show. We'll definitely have to do this again sometime when we're getting ready to start the 2024 college regular season.
Anytime, my man. Take care.